The rain hammered against the crystal chandeliers of the Riverside Grand Hotel as Marcus Williams pushed his yellow mop bucket down the marble hallway. His weathered hands, cracked from years of cleaning solutions and hard work, gripped the handle with quiet dignity. At 62, he had learned that invisible was often the safest way to be. The hotel guests barely glanced at the man who kept their world spotless, their eyes sliding past him like he was just another piece of furniture. But Marcus carried something they couldn't see, a symphony that lived in his chest, melodies that had been silenced by circumstance but never truly died. Tonight, that music would refuse to stay quiet any longer. The evening had started like any other. Marcus arrived at 6 p.m. sharp, just as the hotel's elite clientele began gathering for the annual charity gala in the grand ballroom. Women in $1,000 gowns glided past him, their perfume creating invisible barriers between his world and theirs. Men in tailored tuxedos discussed business deals worth more than Marcus would earn in a lifetime, their voices echoing off the walls he had just finished polishing. "Excuse me." A sharp voice cut through his thoughts. Mrs. Wellington, the hotel manager, stood before him with her usual expression of barely contained irritation. "The ballroom needs to be pristine before the auction begins. We have some very important donors tonight." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Yes, Mom. I'll take care of it right away." As he entered the ballroom, his breath caught in his throat. There, bathed in golden spotlight, stood a magnificent Steinway grand piano. Its ebony surface reflected the room's opulent decorations like a dark mirror, and Marcus felt his fingers twitch involuntarily. It had been 3 years since he touched piano keys, 3 years since he'd lost his job as a music teacher when the school district made budget cuts. 3 years since he'd been forced to choose between his pride and his survival. Beautiful, isn't it? Marcus turned to find a young woman in a simple black dress watching him. Unlike the other guests, her eyes held no judgment, only curiosity. "Yes, miss." "It certainly is," Marcus replied quietly, returning his attention to his mop. "I'm Sarah Chen," she said, extending her hand. "I'm supposed to be the evening's entertainment, but—" She gestured helplessly at her right arm, which Marcus now noticed was in a sling. "Torn rotator cuff. Doctor's order, sir. No playing for at least 6 weeks." Marcus paused in his cleaning. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Music is—" He searched for words that wouldn't reveal too much. "Music is important." Sarah studied his face with the intensity of someone who recognized a kindred spirit. "You play, don't you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus had spent 3 years hiding this part of himself, burying it beneath the uniform and the humble work that kept food on his table. But something in Sarah's voice, perhaps the same longing he felt every time he heard a melody, made him nod slowly. "I used to," he whispered. Before either could say more, Mrs. Wellington's voice boomed across the ballroom. "Marcus, what are you doing chatting with the guests? Get back to work immediately." Heat flooded Marcus's face as dozens of elegantly dressed people turned to stare. He saw their expressions shift from mild interest to dismissive amusement. Here was the help, forgetting his place. "Sorry," he muttered, pushing his mop bucket toward the far corner of the room. But Sarah followed him. "Mrs. Wellington," she called out, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "I'm afraid there's been a complication with tonight's performance." The manager hurried over, her face pale. "What kind of complication?" "The auction begins in 20 minutes. My injury is worse than I thought. I can't play tonight." Sarah's lie was delivered with such conviction that even Marcus believed it for a moment. "However, I believe I may have found a solution." She turned to Marcus with eyes that seemed to say, "Trust me. This gentleman was just telling me he plays piano." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, like a dam breaking, laughter erupted throughout the ballroom. Rich, condescending laughter that cut through Marcus like broken glass. "The janitor?" someone called out. "Oh, this is Rich." "What's next? The valet conducting the symphony?" another voice added, triggering fresh waves of laughter. Mrs. Wellington's face had gone from pale to scarlet. "Sarah, I don't know what you're thinking. Buter. Can I mop or play for a meal?" Marcus interrupted quietly, his voice barely audible above the crowd's amusement. The words came from somewhere deep inside him, a place where dignity lived alongside desperation. "Because I haven't eaten today, and I'm willing to earn my keep however I can." The laughter died as suddenly as it had begun, something in his tone, not begging, but not proud either, just honest, created an uncomfortable silence. Sarah stepped forward. "Give him 5 minutes. If the audience isn't satisfied, I'll figure out something else." Mrs. Wellington looked around the room at faces that showed everything from skepticism to cruel anticipation. Several wealthy donors had their phones out, clearly expecting to record what they assumed would be an embarrassing spectacle. "Fine," she said finally. 5 minutes. "But when this goes badly, it won't," Sarah said firmly. Marcus walked to the piano on legs that felt disconnected from his body. The bench seemed both familiar and foreign as he sat down, his work-worn hands hovering over keys that gleamed like ivory teeth. For a moment, the weight of every eye in the room pressed down on him like a physical force. Then he closed his eyes and let his fingers find their home. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor floated into the silence like a gentle rain after drought. Marcus's hands, so accustomed to scrubbing and mopping, moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible. The music poured out of him, 3 years of suppressed melodies, decades of love for an art form that had never stopped being part of his soul. The ballroom transformed. Where moments before there had been mocking laughter, now there was absolute stillness. The melody swelled and danced, carrying everyone present on a journey they hadn't expected to take. Marcus's playing wasn't just technically perfect, it was alive with emotion, with story, with a kind of depth that could only come from someone who had known both beauty and struggle. As the piece built to its climactic passage, Marcus felt tears on his cheeks. This was who he was, and not just the man who cleaned their floors, but the man who could make music weep and soar and sing. His fingers found every nuance, every delicate phrase, building toward a resolution that left the final notes hanging in the air like a prayer. When silence returned, it lasted for several heartbeats. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Others joined, and soon the entire ballroom erupted in applause that was nothing like the earlier laughter. This was applause born of amazement, of recognition, of shame for their earlier assumptions. Marcus opened his eyes to find Sarah smiling at him through her own tears. Around the room, he saw faces that had been transformed by his music, some moved to tears, others simply stunned by what they had witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah announced, her voice thick with emotion, "I present Marcus Williams, not your janitor, but a master musician who has been hiding in plain sight." Mrs. Wellington stepped forward, her face a mixture of embarrassment and wonder. "Marcus, I had no idea." "Why didn't you ever?" "Because you never asked," he said gently, without accusation. "And because sometimes we become what people need us to be, even when it means setting aside who we are." An elderly man in an expensive suit approached the piano. Marcus recognized him as Mr. Harrison, one of the hotel's most influential regular guests. "Young man," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I've heard performances at Carnegie Hall that didn't move me half as much as what you just did. What are you doing? Cleaning floors?" "Surviving," Marcus answered simply. "After I lost my teaching position, this was honest work. I'm grateful for it." Mr. Harrison turned to address the room. Tonight was supposed to be about charity, about helping those in need. But maybe we've been looking in the wrong places. He faced Marcus again. How would you like to teach private lessons to my granddaughter? She's been struggling to find passion in her music. I think you might be exactly what she needs. And my son, called out a woman in a silver gown. He's been taking lessons for years but has no soul in his playing. The community center has been looking for a music director, added another voice. The pay isn't much, but Marcus held up his hands, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Sarah whispered beside him. Say yes to becoming yourself again. As the evening continued, Marcus found himself surrounded by people who really saw him for the first time. The charity auction raised twice its expected amount, with several donors specifically requesting that portions of their contributions go toward establishing a music scholarship fund in Marcus's name. Later, as the guests filtered out into the night, Marcus sat alone at the piano, his fingers moving slowly over the keys in a gentle improvisation. The yellow mop bucket still stood nearby, a reminder of where the evening had begun. Sarah approached, having stayed behind to help pack up the sound equipment. You know, she said thoughtfully, I wasn't really lying earlier. My shoulder does hurt, and I wasn't sure I could give those people the performance they deserved. But you, she smiled. You gave them something they didn't even know they needed. Marcus looked up at her. What's that? A reminder that dignity and talent don't depend on job titles or bank accounts. That sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones we walk past every day without seeing. She paused. Thank you for that reminder. As Marcus finally wheeled his mop bucket toward the storage closet for the last time, he reflected on how a single evening had changed everything. Tomorrow, he would still arrive at 6 p.m. but as a music teacher preparing to use the hotel's piano for lessons, not as the invisible man who cleaned its floors. The melody that had lived silently in his chest for 3 years was finally free, and Marcus Williams was no longer hiding in plain sight. Sometimes, he realized, all it takes is one person willing to ask the right question, not what do you do, but who are you? And sometimes, the answer can transform not just one life, but an entire room full of lives that needed to remember what it meant to truly see each other. The rain had stopped, and through the hotel's grand windows, Marcus could see stars beginning to appear in the clearing sky.